Who do we leave out of our history books? And why? What defines if someone is remembered and if someone is forgotten? How many people have been excluded? In all honesty, I don't know. But I can argue for the inclusion of one woman I believe should have been mentioned in our history book, and that is Marsha P. Johnson. Hi, I'm your host, not a historian, and this is the Not Really About History channel. And today, we're going to talk about how Marsha P. Johnson, and in particular, her role in the fight for queer rights. Now, you may be wondering why I want to tell you about this amazing woman, and my answer is that every day I venture out into the world and I see bad things. I see transphobia, I see racism, I see homelessness, I see people who are angry, I see people who are hopeless, and I'm not really a big fan. More specifically, an event that inspired me to make this video was the passing of multi-trans acts and legislations. In today's video, I want to show you that although there were many people who helped lead the gay liberation movement, Marsha P. Johnson would have a large impact on the fight for gay rights through her work for housing trans youth, uniting the queer community, and fighting on the front lines during protests for gay and trans rights. And maybe along the way, you will learn some strategies on how to improve our modern world. To start off, I would like to say that in the period before the gay liberation movement, specifically the 1900s, queer people faced a lot of discrimination. Being gay or trans was categorized as a mental disorder. It was illegal to serve liquor to gay people. Queer people were subjected to violence and ridicule, and gay bars were frequently raided. Arrests, as well as looting, were common at these raids. Trans people, especially trans women of color, were targeted by both criminals and police. During the late 1960s to 1970s, queer people decided that enough was enough, and the gay liberation movement began. This is about where Marsha P. Johnson comes in. Marsha P. Johnson was present during the Stonewall riots. These riots were incited by chronic police violence and harassment, in which the patrons of the gay bar, the Stonewall Inn, retaliated and started a series of protests in the name of queer rights. However, this was not all that Marsha P. Johnson did for the queer revolution. Like I said earlier, I've divided her contributions into three main categories: housing trans youth, uniting the queer community, and attending and arranging protests. For category 1, or her work in housing trans youth, there's a couple examples I could use, but the primary one I'm going to be using in this essay is her work with STAR, or Street Transvestite Action Revolution. In an interview titled Rapping with the Street Transvestite Revolutionary, an interview with Marsha P. Johnson, Marsha elaborates on some of STAR's goals for helping the queer community. One of her main goals was to create a new shelter for homeless trans people. She says, quote, "We're going to be doing STAR dances, open a new STAR home, a STAR telephone, 24 hours a day, a STAR recreation center." The reason she says she wants to find a new STAR home is because they had been evicted and removed from their previous shelters, showing how important it is in the first place to have these homes. Many trans people at the time faced homelessness because of discrimination from both police and civilians. Because homelessness was such a big problem in the trans community, creating safe places for her queer siblings was an incredibly powerful form of queer support. Another way that Marsha P. Johnson helped to fight for queer rights was through her work bringing the queer community together. One way this can be seen was actually when she died. On July 16, 1992, the New York Times published an obituary honoring Marsha P. Johnson, saying, quote, "We deeply mourn the loss of our beloved and respected member, a survivor of the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion. As organizers of annual lesbian/gay pride events, Marsha was an inspiration for all of us." Her ability to bring queer people together through her unrelenting kindness for others was vital to the beginnings of the gay liberation movement. Especially at the start, queer rights movements were predominantly dominated by white, cis, gay people, arguing that trans people and people of color did not belong in the queer rights movement. Marsha never stopped fighting for the inclusion of trans people and people of color in the gay revolution. She worked to unite queer people through her work in organizing protests, her work at STAR, attending meetings for activist groups, and more. Even in death, she managed to unite queer people. In a letter written by Randy Wicker, Marsha's roommate, to a commander at the 6th Precinct regarding Marsha's death, Randy says that over 400 people attended Marsha's funeral. Randy lived with Marsha, and even in one of his letters described her as one of his closest friends. If anyone knew how much she meant to the queer community, it would be him. In this letter, he claims to have included several magazine articles and news items to give Commander Kennedy, quote, an idea of how much she meant to the gay community. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize another activist in the queer community at the time. Sylvia Rivera was Marsha's friend and partner in activism. Rivera was there during the Stonewall riots, spoke out for gay and trans rights, and worked with Marsha to create STAR. In a speech given at the 1973 Liberation Parade, Rivera speaks out against the exclusion of people of color, poor people, and trans people in the larger gay movement. Let's watch a clip.
I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that. I do not believe in a revolution, but you all do. I believe in the gay power. I believe in us getting our rights, or else I would not be out there fighting for our rights. That's all I wanted to say to your people. If you all want to know about the people that are in jail, and do not forget Bambi Lamore and Dora Marks, Kenny Messner, and other gay people that are in jail, come and see the people at Star House on 12th Street, on 640 East 12th Street, between B and C, apartment 14. The people that are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle class, white club. And that's what you all belong to. Revolution now!
Patrick, hold my juice. And for legal reasons, this is cranberry juice. Sylvia Rivera was just one of the many trans women of color who put themselves in danger in the name of queer rights. She had been beaten by police, she had been harassed, she had been assaulted by civilians and police alike, all in the name of living her true identity and fighting for others and her own rights. My final example of how Marsha P. Johnson contributed to the gay rights movement is how she continued to fight on the front lines in protests for queer rights. In a second obituary written for her, the writer says that Marsha organized a second Pride Parade that would include trans people and drag queens that would march in front of the official Pride Parade that banned them from entering. This is just one of the many protests that Marsha had organized and attended. Marsha was even at the protest that kicked off the gay rights movement in the first place, the Stonewall riots. Whilst Marsha P. Johnson was not reported to actually be the one who started the riots, in a later interview saying that she had arrived after the riots began, she did attend and fight during them. Many people said that trans women and queens were the ones who fought on the front lines during these protests because they had nothing to lose at this point. Marsha was reported to be directly standing up to police during these riots. In a world where civilians and police were intent on erasing her and her identity, she continued to stand up and push against the system that was abusing her and her trans siblings. Johnson continued to fight for her rights by protesting despite the dangers. To wrap up our little dive into queer history, I would like to say that despite all the work that she did for the queer revolution, she is not in many history books. And I think that she has earned herself a mention. Although she is not included in textbooks, I ask you to remember her for her kindness to trans youth, her willingness to bring queer people together, and her strong will in fighting for queer rights on the front lines against groups that have repeatedly hurt her. We would not live in the same America without her. And with that, this has been Not Really a History Channel with your host, Not Really a Historian. And I'll see you next time.
Yeah!